The rejection email had not even arrived yet, but Daniel already knew. He felt it in the way the elevator doors closed too slowly, in the reflection of his tired face on the polished steel, in the weight pressing against his chest as if the building itself had decided he was not worthy to stay inside it. He walked out of the glass tower with empty hands, a thin resume folder under his arm, and the quiet shame of a father who had promised his child things he wasn't sure he could still give. The city moved around him without mercy. Cars rushed past, people laughed into their phones, shoes clicked with purpose on the pavement. Daniel stood still for a moment, staring at the ground, replaying the interview again and again in his head. He had stumbled over a question about long-term availability, hesitated when they asked about overtime, and he knew exactly when the room changed. The moment he mentioned his son. The moment he said he was a single dad. He had prepared for weeks. Late nights after his son fell asleep, practicing answers in a whisper so he wouldn't wake him. Borrowing a suit that didn't quite fit, polishing shoes that had seen better years, believing, just for a little while, that this interview could change everything. Rent was overdue. The fridge was nearly empty. His son's school trip permission slip sat unsigned on the kitchen table because the fee might as well have been $1,000. As Daniel walked away from the building, he didn't look back. He told himself it was just another no in a long line of no's. Another door closing quietly, politely, without explanation. He tightened his grip on his phone and checked the time. He had to pick up his son from daycare soon. At least that part of his life still depended on him, still believed in him. Inside the building, on the top floor, the billionaire CEO stood by the window, watching the city like he always did when his mind was restless. Alexander Reed had everything people thought mattered, money, influence, power, but lately, none of it had been able to quiet the old memories. He had sat in on the interview not because he needed to, but because something in the candidate list had caught his eye. A single father. A gap in employment. Strong recommendations from a previous company that had shut down. During the interview, Alexander had remained silent, observing. He noticed how Daniel's hands trembled just slightly, how his answers were honest but unpolished, how his eyes softened when he mentioned his son. He noticed the discomfort in the room when the topic of family came up, the subtle judgment masked as professionalism. And he noticed something else too, integrity. The kind that doesn't beg or exaggerate, the kind that quietly hopes. When the interview ended, Daniel thanked them and left. The hiring manager sighed and shook her head, already moving on to the next candidate. Alexander stayed silent, but something twisted in his chest. A feeling he hadn't felt in years. Minutes passed. Alexander's assistant mentioned lunch. A call came in from a board member. But Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the man who had just walked out of the building believing he had failed. He remembered another man, years ago, walking away from an interview in a worn jacket, rejected because he couldn't stay late, because he had a child waiting at home. He remembered himself. Alexander turned abruptly and asked which way the candidate had gone. When his assistant looked confused, Alexander didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, something he almost never did himself anymore. The doors closed, and for the first time in a long while, his heart raced, not from a business deal, but from urgency. Outside, Daniel sat on a bench at the bus stop, staring at nothing. He felt hollow. He tried to breathe, tried to tell himself that his son didn't need money as much as he needed love, but love didn't pay rent. Love didn't keep the lights on. Love didn't stop the landlord from knocking. He pulled out his phone and saw a missed call from daycare. Panic shot through him before he realized it was just a reminder. He stood up, slung his worn bag over his shoulder, and started walking. Behind him, a voice called out his name. At first, Daniel thought he was imagining it. He kept walking. The voice came again, louder, breathless. He turned around slowly, confused, and saw a man in an expensive coat jogging toward him, hair slightly out of place, eyes focused only on him. Daniel froze. The CEO of the company. The man from the top floor. The last person he expected to see chasing him down a busy sidewalk. Alexander stopped a few feet away, catching his breath, completely unconcerned with the stares of passers-by. He looked at Daniel not as a failed candidate, but as a human being. Daniel's first instinct was embarrassment. He straightened his jacket, wondering what mistake he had made. Maybe he had left something behind. Maybe they needed him to sign something. Maybe they wanted to officially reject him. Instead, Alexander spoke quietly, sincerely. He told Daniel that the interview hadn't gone unnoticed. That his honesty had mattered. That his priorities had said more about his character than any rehearsed answer ever could. Daniel listened, stunned, his mind struggling to catch up with his heart. Hope was a dangerous thing. He had learned not to trust it. Alexander continued, explaining that the company didn't just need skill, it needed people who understood responsibility, resilience, and sacrifice. People who knew what it meant to show up even when it was hard. Daniel's eyes burned. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded, unsure whether this was real. Alexander offered him the job. Not as charity, not as pity, but as trust. A position with flexibility, support, and room to grow. A chance not just to work, but to rebuild. For a moment, the noise of the city faded. Daniel felt something break inside him, something heavy and painful that had been building for years. Tears welled up, and he didn't bother hiding them. He thought of his son's smile. Of the empty fridge. Of the permission slip on the table. Of every night he had whispered apologies to a sleeping child. He accepted. That evening, Daniel picked up his son with a lighter step. When his son asked how the interview went, Daniel knelt down, hugged him tight, and told him that sometimes, walking away doesn't mean the end. Sometimes, it's the moment just before everything changes. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were hopeful. Daniel worked hard, learned fast, and proved that belief, when given honestly, multiplies. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. And slowly, life began to feel less like survival and more like living. Alexander watched from a distance, not as a billionaire CEO, but as someone who had once been given a second chance and understood the power of passing it on. He saw in Daniel the proof that success isn't built only on talent, but on compassion. Years later, Daniel would sit across from another nervous candidate, a single mother this time, and remember the day he walked away believing he had failed. He would remember the sound of footsteps running after him, the moment someone saw his worth when he couldn't. And he would choose to run after her too. Because sometimes, the world doesn't change when you win. It changes when someone refuses to let you lose alone. The promotion came quietly, without ceremony, on a rainy Tuesday morning. Daniel was sitting at his desk, reviewing reports while checking his phone every few minutes, waiting for a message from his son's school. His son had a small fever that day, and even though the doctor said it was nothing serious, Daniel's heart stayed restless. Parenthood had rewired him permanently. Success meant nothing if his child wasn't okay. When the email arrived from Alexander Reed, short and direct, Daniel read it twice before it sank in. He was being promoted to lead a new team. More responsibility. More trust. More proof that the second chance he'd been given was real. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the sound of rain against the windows wash over him. Just a year ago, he had been walking away from this same building believing he had failed at life. Now he was becoming part of decisions that shaped its future. But growth has a way of testing people just when they begin to feel safe. With the promotion came pressure. Long meetings. High expectations. Deadlines that didn't care about school pickups or sick days. Daniel tried to balance everything the way he always had, by sacrificing sleep, skipping meals, stretching himself thin so his son would never feel the strain. Slowly, the weight began to show. One evening, Daniel arrived late to daycare for the first time since he'd started the job. His son was sitting alone on a small chair, swinging his legs, trying to be brave. When he saw Daniel, his face lit up, but there was a flicker of hurt behind the smile. That night, after his son fell asleep, Daniel sat in the dark living room, the city lights flickering through the window. He realized something painful. He had worked so hard to become stable that he was close to becoming absent. The very thing he had promised himself he would never be. The next morning, Daniel requested a meeting with Alexander. Old fear crept back in as he waited, the familiar anxiety of asking for understanding in a world that often punished it. But when he spoke honestly, without rehearsed words, Alexander listened. Alexander didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, eyes thoughtful, as Daniel explained his struggle. When Daniel finished, expecting disappointment, Alexander surprised him again. He shared a story Daniel had never heard before, about a son he rarely saw growing up, about choices made too late, about success that came at a personal cost he could never undo. This time, it was Alexander whose voice carried regret. They adjusted Daniel's workload. They built a system that allowed parents to lead without losing their families. Slowly, quietly, the culture of the company began to shift. Not because of policies, but because of example. At home, Daniel learned to forgive himself for not being perfect. He learned that strength wasn't endless sacrifice, it was knowing when to protect what mattered most. His son grew healthier, happier, unaware of how close his father had once come to losing hope. Years passed. Daniel's hair showed threads of gray now, but his eyes carried peace. On his son's graduation day, as he watched him step forward confidently, Daniel felt something deeper than pride. He felt gratitude, for the failure that led him to that interview, for the courage to keep walking, and for the man who had run after him when he needed it most. After the ceremony, his son hugged him and whispered words Daniel would never forget. He said, "I always knew you'd be okay, Dad." In that moment, Daniel understood the full meaning of success. It wasn't the title on his office door or the numbers in his bank account. It was being present. It was choosing humanity over fear. It was becoming the kind of person who stops, turns around, and runs after someone else who is walking away in silence. Life will test you. It will close doors, exhaust you, and make you question your worth. But remember this, failure is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the scene that makes the redemption powerful. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own quiet battles, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Silent Soul Stories. Stay with us, because every soul deserves to be seen, and every ending holds the promise of a new beginning.